Okay, so welcome to the Node API Node.js team meeting for November 17th, 2023. Before we get started, are there any announcements that people would like to share? Okay, if not, I'm going to share our issues labeled minus sharing issues tag 11. So the tracking issues for V8.
We don't have many more issues to check here, so I believe at the moment we can close this.
Okay. Sure, we can close it.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I think I already asked at the beginning if there are any announcements or anything like that. So I don't think there's there. I don't think there's any updates on the C language bindings or the coverage, unless anybody else has some info on that. Similarly, for debug testing, we can then, I think, go to stale issues. And I think really only the one that's there is the add-on example, which is, I don't think, super high priority. So anything to discuss on stale issues?
No.
No? Okay. So that takes us to issues in the repo. And let me get to the right repo. Okay, so this one, right. So I think I could be confused or forgot. Maybe I'm thinking of something else. I thought, like, at least for one of the cases, we made things opt in through another define. Maybe that was a different PR.
Okay, yeah, so this one. So let's see. I actually ran into quite an interesting problem. I was trying to turn on experimental, right, for Node add-on API.
Right.
And what I found was, and also run it under all the relevant versions of Node.js. So that means 18, 20, and current, right?
Yep.
And the interesting thing that I found was that NAPI experimental means different things in different versions of Node, right? Like, for example, in Node current, NAPI experimental means that Node API post finalizer exists, right? If you turn it off, it doesn't exist. But that behavior is unique to current. If you do the same thing in Node 18, Node API post finalizer doesn't exist, whether or not you turn on an API experimental.
Sure. Yep.
Right. So that fact makes it impossible to use the presence or absence of an API experimental to determine whether Node API post finalizer exists or not, because it also depends on the version of Node that you're running or that you're building against.
Right.
So
yep.
So that's so, and at the same time, we last week we discussed with Vladimir whether we really want to add that second flag for the Node GCN, because and Vlad can speak to that some more, but he basically said that it's a very important change because it makes this crash detection basically compile time rather than runtime. And so we should not do it with two flags, right? So that people who do experimental, they are now forced to reckon with this situation of us having pure finalizers, even at compile time. But anyway, we can talk about that later. However, the two in conjunction bring up an interesting point. If we do a second flag, then we'll be able to tell whether Node API, we'll be able to tell whether a given feature is available or not, right? So my kind of conclusion was that maybe every time we change the contents of the experimental section, we should add a flag because then if you're building with NAPI experimental, but you're building against an old version of Node.js, now you know that although NAPI experimental is defined, this feature will not be available because it's an old version of Node.js. And so everything we add into NAPI experimental, like every feature we add, we also add a flag, because then we have flags for everything basically. And then
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I believe you are talking another PR which is located in the Node.js core, and this
Yes.
specific PR is not about the additional feature flag, additional feature definition. So maybe we can go ahead with the another PR
But
first.
hold on a minute. Isn't this the one that failed on 18? Because this is where I first found the problem, and the solution for the problem in Node add-on API lies in Node core. That's how the two are connected. So see, like if you look down at the tests, this PR fails, right? It fails in a bunch of places.
Right. Right.
So, and that's because I say, like, if def and API experimental, then call node API post finalizer, but that fails in 18 because
That's
well, yeah,
exist.
but I still believe that the change in this PR is still another topic that makes the finalizer that allowing JavaScript execution be the default finalizer. So I believe this can be another topic we can discuss aside from the feature definition, which you made in the core, the PR you made in core. So
Okay.
yeah,
Right. Okay. So
believe
like
we
I'm
can-
probably thinking that we added a flag, but we did that for some other earlier feature, right?
Like
I think maybe we can see this in. Like my comment was like I thought in one case we added a feature like a flag to enable it or not, but it sounds like this is maybe a different thing. Is that what you're saying, Chinzong? Or
yeah, I believe that Gabriel has talked about a feature detection in add-on that allows them to detect if a feature is available by macro definition. So currently we don't have such mechanism to detect if a API is defined with NPI experimental, because NPI experimental includes a bunch of new APIs that you have no way to detect if they are actually defined, like say in Node 18.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
right,
We may not have backport new APIs to previous LTS lines. So I believe this can be, well, I mean, they are different topics that it is true that all of these topics are related, but I believe that the PR is not specific to this issue.
right. So like I guess so. We had talked about specifically about like feature detection or not before, so that I can see as a different topic. In this case, though, like I think we had a similar discussion about it when we added some other feature where it's like we want, even though it's experimental, we didn't want to break like everybody who's using experimental. So we put another define that says like, hey, if you're using experimental and you wanted to opt into this behavior, we have an additional define, right?
Yeah.
And then it basically, the forcing function was now going to be when we define a new version of Node API, when you move up to that, now you're broken and you have to actually make the changes, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I was thinking like maybe that was a different feature, but I was thinking maybe it was this one, but I easily confused on that.
Yes.
Yeah,
You're right.
I believe this is a really new mechanism that we hadn't talked about this before. It might be similar to the feature bits we discussed before in the name, but it is actually a different mechanism for add-ons to detect if a new API is available with the current node.js binary. So yeah, I believe it's a new area that we can implement, and to implement it's kind of a new policy that we can implement on adding new node APIs, because it's merely macro definition, so it's not about runtime feature detection.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And
Right.
I think the difference from what we discussed before, previously we said for every new features, like I was proposing that we add special feature flag, and it's supposed to be permanent. And the argument was made that time that more features we have, more flags we're going to have, and it will be almost impossible to test them. And the decision was like we'll have a set of features aligned with each version. But here, what we talk about, now we're creating new experimental features. It maybe makes sense to have experimental feature bit for each new experimental feature. So technically, this way we can distinguish between different node.js versions and the experimental status.
Yes, exactly.
So all these experimental bits and stuff, they'll exist only in experimental state. As soon as we do version, all these bits should disappear.
Exactly.
I would like to call out the difference between the feature bits we discussed before with this feature detection macro definition, because the feature bits are runtime.
Yes.
Yeah.
At runtime, but this macro definition is only at build time macro definition, so it goes away. It doesn't affect the runtime behavior.
Exactly.
No, yeah. So it only about the macro definition. Like say you can detect if this node API function is really available against your Node.js version you are going to build against, right? So it's nothing about runtime feature.
Right. It could just be a define.
Yeah, that's exactly the idea. Yeah.
It could be like NAPI experimental post finalizer.
Yep, exactly. That's exactly what I'm thinking.
When we build a add-on, it has two branches. One for, like say, we have a API create property key, and the another way is that we don't have this new API, and we can just fall back to API create string, which doesn't hint the string will be a property key. So I believe this can be a this is to best describe this behavior. We can sorry, maybe I can post the link in the chat.
It's compiled only, how we can protect people from running the same plugin, say Node.js version 20 versus Node.js 18 if they're using experimental features.
If you don't get ABI stability if it's experimental.
Yeah, this definition is only useful in experimental, because when it goes out of experimental, you can say that if you have API version 8, you must have all the version 8 APIs available, right? So you don't have to detect if specific function is available. I posted a link in the chat. Maybe we can discuss the use case for this APIs, like say feature detection. rather than feature based. Yeah. For example, when we have a API create property key available, we can use that. Or if the API create property key is not available, we can just fall back to API create string.
Yeah.
Right, because like I think it's like for me, it's we probably want to run our tests for Node API. We want to try and test some of the experimental features, right? So like we want to turn on experimental, and test like say this new feature, but at the same time, we should also have an equivalent test that says, well, I'm testing without experimental turned on, and it should still work, or the test shouldn't run at all. Like if this is something that requires experimental features, it should only run if experimental has been defined, right?
Yeah,
if you're talking about, are you talking about Node core tests?
No, I'm talking about Node API
test,
right? Because
exactly.
it's got to run with multiple different versions of Node, and like
yes,
16 experimental means a different thing from 18.
Yeah.
Anything which is not experimental should be guarded by the Node API version, right?
Yes, so that's right.
When something goes out of experimental and goes into, but I guess it gets to the point where it's like if it's Node API version 9, or we could end up with some ifs that say like if it's greater than Node API version 9, then we know we have the function. Or if it's experimental and we have Node API version and we're Node version X or something. I don't know. That does get complicated, but
What the expression is as follows. It's defined an API experimental and defined feature flag, or an API version greater than whatever it was when we wrote the code.
Right. That seems to work, right? Otherwise, you say no, don't got it.
Exactly. Right. Yes. And the reason for the or an API version greater than whatever it is when we wrote the code is that that and only that will allow us to drop these flags, because otherwise we'd have to keep a bag of these flags around inside the NAPI experimental block forever. But
we can really only add that or greater than blah when we know we've added it to a version that's greater than that.
Yeah, and we know that, right? Like
we know when we do that. So yes,
exactly, yeah. So the bottom line is that the contents of the NAPI experimental section, every time we add to the contents of the NAPI experimental section, we also add a feature flag saying this is what we added. And then when we release a new version, we can drop those flags because we know that all the guards say an API experimental and the flag, or the version we're about to release. And so we drop the flags, but the second half of the branch will make sure that those features are being used after they have been released. So I think that would be a good policy.
I think that makes sense. I mean, this is not a new problem, I don't think. Like, I think we've always had this problem. Maybe we're just running into it now. Like, we easily had cases where, 16 had some functions defined, or 18 had some functions defined if you turned on experimental that like 16 wouldn't have turned on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, even after release. Yeah. So like I said, the place where I ran into it was when I tried to systematically increase our test matrix for Node's add-on API to also so basically add a second dimension, which is experimental and stable. Stable works fine. Experimental doesn't work because we're missing these feature flags.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. So then I propose that I open a PR to add a feature flag for post finalizer, and then we'll also need a feature flag for Node.js types that I added in that PR that still needs reviewing. Okay, so that was my question regarding these feature flags.
But thank you. I think it's important to say that whenever we have experimental version, all these feature flags are enabled by default, right? So people should not do anything extra to enable it. So technically, the purpose actually for these flags not to enable or disable these experimental features, but pretty much notify code that these features are there.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I think in the other case, we did make the choice to say, like, you have to pass us a define to turn it on, because otherwise it would have broken too much experimental stuff.
Yeah.
But for anything like this, which is an addition, it's just to inform you that it's there. It's not a guard to turn it on or off.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm thinking call it like node API have X, node API have Y, or node.
But I think it should be experimental.
Yes. Sorry, yes,
experimental have blah, right?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So that's going to be the naming. Okay, and you're right, Vlad. This doesn't answer the question as to whether we want to conditionally expose things inside the experimental section. That's a different topic. You're right.
And I think we just like that's a case by case basis, right? Like most of the time, I don't think it matters. We're adding new things. That doesn't break anybody. It's more just like, even though it's experimental, there might be a case where it would be better to let people opt in versus breaking all the existing code. So, but I think that's more of a like, we can look at that on each one. Whereas this case, it sounds like every time we add something significant, we should probably add these defines along with them.
Yes, and I'm sorry I blurred the lines on this one because Vladimir was arguing last week that we should not have the opt-in for the node.js. So that's another thing we need to discuss. But it's separate from the feature flags thing. We have now settled the feature flags thing, and that's going to come up when we're talking about the node.js PR in core.
Okay.
We probably need to call it with a more intuitive name rather than a flag or bits, which may be confusing for people. Maybe, like say, confusing it with the runtime feature detection. Runtime feature flags, yeah.
But these are not runtime. These are like, it'd be experimental.
Yeah, it's just a feature detection to see if a feature is available. It doesn't involve any switch on or off, right? So yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so anything more we should discuss on that one?
No, I will lay the groundwork in core, and then once that happens, these tests should then pass. Yes, they are.
I think it might be worth, like, in that one we can, like, if you allocate,
Oh yeah, no, outside the heap.
If you allocate a native struct, it doesn't come out of the JavaScript heap.
No, that's right. Yeah.
But if you create JavaScript objects, the answer is yes, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So here, I think we can say, if you allocate native objects, they don't consume space in JavaScript. However, if you use the node APIs to create JavaScript functions, then they use R to come from script. So maybe
there is another interesting wrinkle here. Now that I think about it, we have an API to report memory usage, right? And I think that affects the accounting by counting whatever you created natively as part of the JavaScript heap, so that the total memory usage does not exceed the limit. So you can opt into reporting this.
But I think you have to use, I think, like the node, like the things that are reported by the node runtime, you need to use specific allocators to get that. There is like a function which is like tell the VM that you've allocated things.
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure how that affects the accounting, but I suspect that because it says it says memory usage has changed by X, and X is a signed integer. So you can say it has decreased or you can say it has increased. And so I think that affects the accounting. Like you're basically saying, pretend this memory that I have just allocated is part of the heap and account for that.
I think actually it doesn't say as part of the heap. I think it says as part of the process. Maybe you're right. Maybe that function that informs here. Let's find that function.
Yeah.
Which one is that? That is.
It's called a API adjust external memory.
Yes, that one.
Okay.
Oh, I see. So it influences the garbage collector.
Right, exactly. That's what I was thinking. Like, I don't think we'd see that added as like a value in the heap or anything, but it basically says like, hey, we used a whole bunch of this memory, and that affects then when it decides to GC potentially.
Yeah, okay. All right, yeah, so it's not that. Okay, that's good.
So, but maybe that's worth mentioning, right? It's like,
yeah.
Inside
you can provide a hint of native memories you have allocated through, but that does not affect how much you can allocate. JavaScript heap provides info that the GC might use to decide to try.
Run more often. Yeah.
Otherwise, on the assumption that some of that memory might be alive.
Yep.
Yeah, so
one of the questions, like, should we do anything like this inside of Node API implementation? Other cases, then we allocating quite a bit memory, like for buffers and stuff. Do we notify V8 about it?
You mean for things like references?
Right.
That's a good question.
So imagine somebody allocates a buffer. It can be quite significant memory allocated outside.
Oh, you mean like inform automatically? Oh, but that could be a problem because we can double count. Like what if the add-on developer was responsible and did inform, and now we're informing and they're informing, and it's going to exacerbate the allocation. So we cannot be sure whether they called this API or not.
It is an interesting thing whether we could do more automatically, and we could then document that, like, hey, if you create a reference, we automatically call the just for you.
Right? Well, actually, in that case, we don't need to document anything because the add-on developer does not know the size of a reference because that's an internal structure to our implementation. So they wouldn't know what to tell adjust external memory anyway, right? Like size of what? They don't have access to the reference structure. So because of that, we could say that it is our responsibility to call adjust external memory, every time we create the reference because we know the size of the structure. We announce it, and now the garbage collector behaves accordingly. And that you could argue that is correct behavior. But it's completely internal to our implementation.
Yeah, there's two bits. Like we could do more to say, like when we allocate our internal memory, let's add that in. I don't think we have any of those big blocks of memory where it really
No,
matters.
we don't. Yeah, that's right. No.
But
But
I could, yeah, go ahead.
well, yes and no, because I mean, if you create copious amounts of native backed objects, those references can add up, right?
Yeah, so it's it's our call to say, like, do we add enough through those that it would make sense to do the tracking and have the overhead of making the extra calls, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because you're right. Because on the other hand, if you do create copious amounts of objects, you want that to be fast and not, waste time on, well, arguably waste time on making these extra calls with each creation. So yeah, it's a trade-off.
The more interesting part, just off the top of my head, might be like if they create a buffer and we know that they asked for a buffer that was like 100 meg, we could then automatically do the inform. Like you just created a 100 meg buffer, so hey, that took a bunch of time. We could do the inform.
But what if they also did the inform because they are aware of this function because we have documented it? So now we're
That's
saying
where the documentation would have to say, like, if you call blah function, we will automatically inform for you, right? Or do we just leave it to them, which is what we've got today, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, we could change the behavior, do a feature flag, experimental, and take it off their hands the next time they move up. And do like the runtime feature detection, like we're doing with the GC stuff. So yes, we could, because now we have the mechanism for making behavioral changes.
I think we could, like, I'm not sure it's our highest priority thing to worry about. Like they have a way they can inform it. I wouldn't, if somebody has like, hey, we really should, and I could
because
I could be convinced, but like my top one thing is like it's probably okay the way it is.
Yeah, it would have potentially memory allocation benefits, and node processes would have a lower memory footprint. But yeah, I don't know if that is the highest priority we have, because you can manage memory differently. This is not the only mechanism for managing memory,
And you can only make so much good. Like this is just a hint. There's no guarantee the GC does anything.
Exactly, that's right.
Does this description sound good for this one?
That looks good to me.
Everybody okay? I'll push the button. Okay. Guess this one's not new. So yeah, I don't know quite what to do with that. It's a damn code. Anyway, I'll just, unless there's anything else in here that we should be discussing? If not, I'm going to flip over to Node and strip that off. Oops, strip off. No, it's label I want. Okay. I know somebody mentioned this. Is there anything we should discuss on this one?
Yeah. I just commented on the PR, and I believe it will need more amend on the code, so it's progressing. Yes.
Okay, so it's progressing. Nothing to, as long as there's nothing we need to. This one, I think you mentioned earlier a discussion around like whether we should have a opt-in or not, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like on this one, maybe I don't know if this is the one we discussed it earlier in terms of like without that opt-in, is it going to break a whole whack of code, or is it that like without that opt-in, it's going to break only a small amount of code where people were doing things wrong.
Well, without the opt-in, it's going to break people who are running with experimental. Because if you don't have the experimental defined, then all of this goes away, right? Because it's stable.
And
So,
only when they are targeting the 18 or 16,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So wait a sec, this is still under experimental, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, it is. It is.
Right. But it changes the shape of the API.
Yes, it does.
Does all experimental code break, basically?
Yeah,
Or is it some
potentially.
yeah, okay. So
there's going to be compilation errors and warnings depending on your flags. If you're in C++, you're almost certainly going to get compilation errors.
okay. So basically, without some sort of opt-in, everybody's broken who's used experimental.
Yep. Pretty sure.
And that's kind of where I think, like in that case, that's where I was thinking it would be good to have a flag that says you can opt into this, you can test. When we define Node API 9 or 10 or whichever it is, then people will be forced, right? Like there will be no choice. Their code will but that will be like, because we've said that's an opt-in. Okay, good. You've agreed to opt in to move up, and that's why we're saying that breaking, having to change your code then makes sense, right? Generally today, like people for experimental, like new things get added. We could remove things and your code could break, but like I don't think that's probably happened to any great extent.
Yeah, we've pretty much been additive so far.
So I just wonder the value of of doing something that just like anybody who's got something compiling with experimental just stops working, right? Like, is it really is it worth doing that versus you had to do this extra define if you do want to try it out, and if you don't, you're still okay.
Okay, so I just realized something. If we add this extra define, then we're going to have a second period where it's no longer opt-in, you are opted in automatically, right? So we're going to change the second like we have if defined and API experimental and defined node API experimental node GC, right?
Right.
And we're gonna prefix that at some point with if not defined node API experimental node GC, then define node API experimental node GC. So it is defined whether you like it or not, and that's going to be a step preceding the release where it becomes stable, right?
No, I would just say like the point where it becomes part of the, like when we bump the Node API version, that's when the forcing function happens.
Okay, so we don't want to give folks a period where it's still experimental, but it's no longer opt-in.
No, like that's where it's like we've agreed that border is where we force people to do things.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Are we talking about? I believe I'm sorry, but I'm confused that yeah, I'm pretty confused about that. We are adding another experimental flag, and that feature under the new experimental flag would jump into stable without going through API experimental.
Well, it is kind of an API experimental, but it's kind of experimental within the experimental. So then when you do hit the release barrier, you're going to hit it that much harder.
Yeah. If I understand correctly, Michael is just mentioned that we add a new API experimental flag for this particular feature, and it doesn't have to go through an API experimental stage, and it can jump into API stable.
I'm like, in addition to being experimental, so it still would be guarded by experimental.
Yeah.
So you'd have to turn on experimental, and then you would have to turn on this extra thing.
Yeah, and when become before it become a be released in a stable version, we have to turn on this particular feature in NPI experimental, regardless it is explicitly involved in.
No, like the two phases that I would see is like you've turned on experimental and you've opted into Node.js. So like you've defined NAPI experimental or Node experimental, and you've defined Node.js. That's like anybody who wants to try it, they can opt in and try it. Once we say like we're ready to promote it, say we make our next version is Node API 11, it now is always on when you opt into, like if you say Node API 11, you get it.
But it will be a surprise for people who are actively
who never opted in.
Yeah, they never opted in during the NPI experimental, but they found that this feature is going to be released in a stable version.
Yeah,
so it might be a surprise to people who are testing with NPI experimental.
That's true. It will be, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, so now it's that versus like breaking them without notice in experimental.
Not necessarily. We can have a ramp up to the release, which is what I was saying, which is a period when this feature is still marked experimental, but the feature flag is on by default. So it's no longer an opt-in. And
Right.
so, we could put out an announcement saying, okay, it shall no longer be opt-in as a version, X.Y of Node.js. And so your code is going to break, but you've had plenty of time to opt into it. And now it's time to opt into it, whether you like it or not. If that's a surprise to you, sorry, we've had this flag on for 5 months. So, you could have opted in at any time. Now we're making you opt in because you've already opted into experimental. So, you should be ready for breakage.
The difference in my mind, though, is that like I could see somebody just say, well, okay, I'm just going to set my CI and I'm going to run with experimental on because I want to try out some new feature, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in one case, that stops working. But they also could not do that, right? Like they could have experimental turned on, but not have tried some new functions or not have like, we basically said when we move up to a new version of Node API, we can change the behavior so that even if you didn't expect that change, like you only get it if you've moved up. So like you're saying, I'm going to version 9. This function I was always calling now does something different, right?
Yeah.
You could have opted into experimental, but never run any tests or written any code that actually was affected by that. I'm trying to think where I'm going. Like, I'm just like, it's like, are people going to be more surprised by the fact that they've got something in experimental that now breaks versus there's something that when they move up to a new version of Node API causes them to make some changes? Right. Like in one case, I've actually gone and said, change my Node API version. In the other case, I haven't changed anything and it falls over. Which is okay in experimental, but it's like,
exactly.
How much of that do we want to be? Like in this case, we would be doing it to everybody.
Well, everybody who's opted into experimental, right? So everybody's CI will all of a sudden, everybody's experimental CI will fail, which is good. We want that because that'll say, oh, wait, what? Is this coming in the next version? Whoops. I better prepare for it, or I'm going to be stuck without all the great new features. I'm going to be stuck with whatever version I'm running stably right now. So, I can't, I'm not going to be able to say, Node API 10. Oh, well, I better fix my CI then.
Yeah, I'm pretty confused at this point because every new feature has to go through the NPI experimental stage without any opt-in. so that they can trial every new feature
I don't think
that
we
is
said
going to be.
without any opt-in.
No, we haven't.
But
No,
if
but that's
yeah,
what we've practiced.
but if it when a feature that is released under an NPR experimental, but it still needs to be opt-in, then how do people to, like say, trial it before the stable release?
Yeah.
Because that would need explicit opt-in, but with an API experimental threshold, people had already opted into API expander, but they have to opt into another maker god
Oh,
to
yes.
to tell the new feature. That would be I would doubt that if there would be any add-on authors would find this another handle is already well established feature guards on the new features.
Yeah.
Whilst this new feature guard is not well known.
Yes.
So there might be a very hard time for people to try these new features.
Yeah, think about this.
It gets to released.
Think about this. Their experimental CI is chugging along happily. It's nice and green. And we release node.js. Their CI is still nice and green because they haven't opted into this thing. And they look at the CI and it's like, okay, it's green. Okay, so nothing really has happened. And then they try to go to Node API 10, and boom! Not only I mean, their code breaks, right? And it's like, wait, what? Experimental was green. Why is my code breaking all of a sudden?
Because
so, exactly.
what we basically said, there can be breaking changes at that.
But there haven't been, as far as they can tell, there haven't been any breaking changes because their experimental CI was green the whole time before Node 10, and now Node 10 comes out and all their code breaks if they try to use it.
I guess I'm looking at the case where, like, today, if we add a new function in experimental, probably 99% of the people, even if you're running your CI in experimental,
it's not going to
break. No idea there's a new function. They don't test it anyway, right?
Yeah, right.
And so, yeah, okay. So in terms of like getting test coverage, I don't see the difference. I do get the point of, will people be surprised if, like, is there an expectation that if you run with experimental, the next version should work for you, right? Because
I just had an idea. Why don't we flip the thing on its head? You run with experimental, and you can turn off this experimental feature. It's on by default, but you can turn it off, and that's a quick fix to your CI. And you do get the signal that things will break. But your quick fix is to just add this hash define, which will make this new experimental breaks everybody feature go away. But you have been notified that it is coming. And so the quick fix is to add the flag. The longer term fix is to actually change your code, but you will have been notified. And so, we have an opt-out flag inside experimental.
Yeah, it is much better. So we will notify that we have this feature in experimental, and people can use it or not.
Yeah.
It's much better, yes.
I think that's a good idea to include the flag. I'm still wondering whether we want to break everybody who's running, but I'm happy. Let's try it out. If we get a whole bunch of complaints, we'll know for the future whether or not. But having the flag that lets people quickly recover, I think, is definitely a good mitigation.
Yeah.
And also, Michael, I just want to bring that last week we had this discussion about this topic, and it's important to know that after we introduced this new behavior for finalizers, that we require people not to run JavaScript anymore. So effectively, all people already have this runtime issue. So what this PR is doing actually, it's bringing this issue to the compile time. So even if people have happily can compile code today in an API experimental, their code will actually crash at runtime.
Well, that was back to my original question. Like, is this going to break everybody, or is it going to break the people who did things wrong? And it sounded to me like it's going to break everybody, right? Even if your code
it's already breaking everybody. We have already landed Vladimir's change, so it's already breaking everybody. It's just breaking them at runtime, not compile time.
Okay. Well, okay. So that's so let's go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to clarify that change only breaks people who code in JavaScript in the finalizers.
Yep.
Whereas
Right, so
in most cases that I can tell is that they should only code, like say, deleting allocated memory in the finalizers, and they are all fine if they didn't code into JavaScript.
That's good. That's a good point. Yeah. So it
that's
doesn't break
where I see the difference. Like in one case, it's a no-brainer to me because like it's you had code that was wrong. That's probably a small subset of people. And for those people, yeah, if we can tell them sooner than later, versus you have perfectly good running code, but now you're broke.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah,
that's
because
the difference I see between those two cases, right? Like if we just break everybody, regardless of whether or not their code is good, that just seems a little. And you know, if they want to upgrade to the next version of Node API, they're going to have to make the change, but maybe they're never planning to upgrade, right? And so we're kind of forcing work on them is where I'm coming from.
Okay, so then what about the opt-out instead of the opt-in?
I think that mitigate, like we should definitely have the opt-out because at least it makes it easier. We're still forcing work on them, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, you're basically like, hey, your CI went red, you got to spend that, you got to do your work now versus when you've planned to do a Node API upgrade. But it's kind of like what is our expectation of like, hey, we could just say, well, no, you used experimental. Like we always reserve the right. We could remove a function that could break your CI, right? So like,
yep.
It's not that we can't or shouldn't. I'm just like always like, hey, do we want to force work onto people when like what's the balance there, right? In terms of looking at whether it's what we want to do.
Yeah.
Like I said, I would tend to say like make it opt in, but like it sounds like we have consensus or there's a good feeling that we should make it opt out, and I'm okay, and we'll learn. If we get no complaints, then it's like, hey, this is actually easier and better for us, right?
Yeah.
If we end up getting a whole bunch of complaints and pitchforks, we'll say, oh, okay, well,
okay.
We can flip the default, right? Like,
right.
We can learn.
Yeah.
And so.
It is experimental after all, so we can flip
it is experimental,
around.
Exactly. Like, so like maybe I'm overcautious, right? And so, yeah, let's go with the flag to opt out.
Okay.
And see what happens, right? And
okay. So my homework is add feature flags for all the bits in experimental so that we can detect whether they're there, and we can expand our matrix in Node add-on API to test of not only all the currently supported versions of Node, but also both their experimental flavor and the non-experimental flavor. And my second bit of homework is to make on this PR, make it an opt-out.
Like add an opt-out, right? So there's some way to.
Oh, yeah. I may not have added the opt-in. Oh, no, well, if I didn't add the opt-in, then I'll add the opt-out directly. Otherwise,
you can flip it, right? Yeah, whichever. So, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So that's my homework for next week.
And Gabriel, just to bring for the kind of full mix, should we have some kind of another define which said like which stable version of Node API given an API experimental is based on?
Oh, no. I was just thinking about that. I don't think we should do that because for the current version, what do you say? It's like the current version of Node with Node API experimental, but it doesn't yet have this. right? Like if we add two things to an API experimental at any given point, right? It's the same version of Node, it's the same version of experimental, but now, you know, like let's say you build against 21.8 with experimental, which has two things inside the experimental block, and then you build against 21.0, which has only one thing, and it doesn't yet have the other, right? So even within
base version not of Node, but sorry, it's a Node API. Like so imagine like we have an API experimental on top of version 8, one API experimental on top of version 10. It would probably will have still different behavior.
I thought exactly about that, and we have version 9 plus experimental, right? But version 9 plus experimental in 18 doesn't have Node API post finalizer, and experimental plus version 9 on 21 does have post. So does have Node API post finalizer. So basically, if there is a gap between the Node API release and the addition of a feature inside experimental, then that feature is floating, right? We need to have markers every time you add a feature in the exact same commit. You have to add the flag. Otherwise, there will be commits and potentially releases where the feature is there, but the flag is not. And so you don't know, because the last time you added the flag was before the feature was added, and the next time you add a flag is after. And in between, you don't know, is the feature there or not? Depends on the Node version, you know? And so to free ourselves of having to check the Node version, we have to add the feature flag as soon as we add the feature, because then it's clear, it's atomic.
Yeah, I'm not arguing about this feature flags. I'm trying to say about something else.
Sorry.
So what I'm saying, like whenever we're running some test, so currently if we're saying we're using an API experimental, we have no clue if this API experimental is based on what version of Node API is based on. Node API, like is it based on Node API 6, Node API 7, Node API 8? We don't know. Like it's
okay, right? Okay, that's a good point. Okay, right. Okay, but we would have a clue if we had the feature flags, right? Because if you have Node API, have Node GC, if that's on, then you know, or if you have Node API, have post finalizer, then it cannot be version 18. Right? It cannot be an API 8. It can only be an API 9, right? Because we added the
drop off.
feature.
So I'm going to make Gabriel the chair so that it doesn't stop when you can continue discussing.
No, I think it's for future discussion. I think we can end today.
Okay.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah, let's think about it some more.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. Talk to everybody later.